Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be looking into the 2023 Lewiston shootings. Tough topic,
Yeah.
but we're going to try to unpack it using excerpts from the Wikipedia article on the event.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. But that Wikipedia article really is a good resource. It brings together all these different sources and really tries to paint a full picture.
So, Lewiston, Maine, October 25th, 2023. It seems like a lot of this, this horrible event took place in two pretty ordinary places, a bowling alley and a restaurant.
Yeah.
Can you kind of set the scene for us? Like, what happened?
Sure. It was, Wednesday evening, pretty typical night. You had a youth bowling league going on at Just-in-Time Recreation Bowling Alley. And, a few miles away, people were just starting to show up at Shemenji's Bar and Grill restaurant for, dinner and drinks. And then, yeah, things took a very dark turn.
And that's when Robert Card, this 40-year-old Army Reserve veteran, he kind of enters the picture, right?
Right. Yeah. He walks into that bowling alley with a Ruger SFR semi-automatic rifle. And we're talking, .308 Winchester rounds, extended magazine, flashlight, optic. He came prepared.
And it seems like it all happened so fast.
Yeah. It's terrifying how quickly it unfolded. I mean, within minutes, he had opened fire at both locations, leaving 18 people dead and 13 injured. It was clearly a planned attack, not random.
The article mentions two people at the bowling alley, Jason Walker and Michael Deslauriers II, who actually tried to stop Card, when he saw what was happening. Tragically, they didn't survive.
Yeah, it sounds like Card's rifle actually jammed after the first shot. And Walker and Deslauriers, they saw an opening and they tried to intervene, but Card was able to clear the jam. And yeah, they paid the ultimate price trying to protect others.
It's hard to even imagine being in that situation. You also mentioned Schemendes. One of the things that stuck out to me in the article, I don't know if you noticed this, but it said that while Card was reloading, a patron at the restaurant actually turned off the power.
Wow.
Which, that seems so risky. But they might have saved lives by doing that.
Yeah, talk about bravery in the face of danger, right? It just shows you how quickly things were happening. 78 seconds at Schemenji's, less than a minute, and so many lives were changed.
The article goes into a bit of detail about the immediate response from law enforcement, and it seems like the police arrived at both locations, pretty quickly.
Yeah, within minutes.
Which is amazing.
It is. And there's another thing that probably helped. There were some off-duty officers who were at a shooting range nearby. They heard the gunshots and they, responded immediately. So it sounds like everyone involved, from the police to the medical personnel, really did everything they could in those first critical moments.
And then, of course, you have that 49-hour manhunt for Card. It must have been so tense. We know that he was an Army veteran.
Right.
What kind of resources were they using to try to find this guy?
Oh, it was a huge operation. You had the Androscoggin County Sheriff's Office, the Maine State Police, the FBI, the ATF, all involved. They even brought in dive teams with sonar, remotely operated vehicles, searching the Androscoggin River where they found Card's car. The whole state was basically holding its breath, waiting for news.
And then, of course, they find his body, October 27th, dead by suicide in this tractor trailer, not far from his former workplace. You'd think that would bring some sense of closure, but it seems like it really just deepens the mystery.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the relief that the man hunts over, it's immediately replaced by this, need to understand why. Who was Robert Card? Not as a shooter, but as a person. What led him to this?
Right, and that's where things get a little more complicated. Because the picture that the article paints of Card it's kind of hard to reconcile with what we know he did. He was, by all accounts, a quiet guy, dependable, stayed out of trouble. Apart from a DUI and a couple speeding tickets, he didn't have any serious run-ins with the law.
Yeah, it's a real contrast. And that's why it's important to dig a little deeper. And the article spends quite a bit of time talking about Card's mental health. It seems pretty clear that something wasn't right in the months leading up to the shooting.
So let's unpack that a little bit. The article mentions that his hearing started to go in 2022. And around the same time, his personality seems to have changed. He became more withdrawn, more easily angered. It's quite a shift from that, quiet and dependable guy.
Yeah. And it just kept escalating. He started having these, really intense paranoid thoughts, delusions. He thought people were gossiping about him, calling him a pedophile. There were even reports that he started having auditory hallucinations after he got hearing aids. So his mental state was really deteriorating.
And here's the thing. His family noticed these changes. They actually reported his, declining mental health to the authorities in May of 2023. They were really concerned.
And they weren't the only ones. His army unit also reported concerning behavior, threats he was making to shoot up a base back in July 2023. So, the warning signs were there, not just from his family, but from his fellow soldiers.
So he was hospitalized
Yeah.
for psych evaluation?
Yeah. He was actually treated at a psychiatric hospital, but then for whatever reason, he stopped taking his medication. It's like this cascade of events, just started to pick up speed.
But here's the thing. Despite all these red flags, these really serious warning signs, he was still able to get guns. The Army had barred him from handling firearms. It doesn't seem like that was enough.
Right, which raises the question, were there missed opportunities to intervene? And one of the things that struck me in the Wikipedia article was this incident from September 2023. Card punched another reservist who asked him to stop talking about violence. A sheriff's deputy was even called to the scene.
And nothing happened.
Nothing. The deputy, in his own words, felt like he was, in a very disadvantageous position, didn't think he had enough to intervene. But, you read that and you can't help but wonder if something more could have been done.
Yeah, it feels like there were so many points along the way where, intervention was possible, maybe even necessary. This isn't just some senseless act of violence. It's also a potential failure to protect, both Card himself and the community.
It really is. We're talking about mental health, responsible gun ownership, recognizing warning signs, and what happens when those signs are missed.
And then, to make things even more complex, the Wikipedia article brings up Card's social media activity. He was liking and retweeting a lot of far-right transphobic content. I mean, what do we make of that?
That's a really important piece of the puzzle because it suggests that there might have been some ideological influences at play. But we have to be careful here. It's easy to draw a straight line between what someone's doing online and their actions in the real world. It's rarely that simple, but it's definitely a thread we need to pull on to try to understand what happened.
Yeah, it's definitely a tangled web. So many things that seem to have gone wrong. Think about the aftermath of this. The impact on Lewiston itself must have been huge. It's a relatively small city, a little over 36,000 people. I mean, can you imagine?
Oh, it's hard to even fathom. The Wikipedia article talks about shelter-in-place orders, schools going into lockdown, events being canceled. It's like the whole city just stopped, frozen in this wave of fear and grief. And it even went beyond Lewiston. Schools within a 50-mile radius were closed. And even the Canada-U.S. border, they increased security.
Wow, that really puts it into perspective. These events, while they happen in a specific place, they can have such far-reaching effects.
They do. And then you think about the individual impact, the trauma of the survivors, the families, the friends who are left behind, trying to cope with this incredible loss. 31 people directly impacted by Card's actions. And that's not even counting all the people who witnessed it, who felt the fear, who lived through that uncertainty during that 49-hour manhunt.
It's staggering. The article also mentions that gun sales in Maine actually went up after the shootings. Makes you wonder if that's a common reaction.
Yeah.
Like people feeling this need to protect themselves, to regain some control when the world suddenly feels really unsafe.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. After something like that, it's understandable that people would want to feel safe to protect themselves and their families. But it also brings up these questions about, responsible gun ownership, access to mental health care. How do we respond to these events as a society?
Yeah, those are some big questions. We can maybe circle back to that later. For now, I want to talk a little bit about the victims. The article lists all their names and ages, and it's heartbreaking. It's so easy to get caught up in the investigation and kind of lose sight of the fact that these are real people with their own stories. It also mentions that 4 of the victims at Shimenji's were deaf, and they were there for a cornhole tournament.
That really hit me hard. This group of people, they were part of this close-knit community. They were just getting together to have some fun, and then their lives are cut short senselessly. It's a stark reminder that behind the statistics, the headlines, there are real people, real lives lost. And the ripple effects, they're immeasurable.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just Lewiston that was grieving. The article talks about local officials, Governor Mills, Senators King and Collins, even President Biden, offering their condolences, their support. It felt like the whole country was mourning with Lewiston.
Yeah, these tragedies, they have this way of bringing people together in grief and outrage. They force us to confront, just how fragile life is and the consequences of hatred and violence.
And alongside the grief, there are always those calls for action, for change. We have to do something to prevent this from happening again. But the article also mentions something else that happens in the aftermath: the spread of misinformation, disinformation on social media.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how quickly that can happen, especially after a crisis when people are scared, looking for answers, trying to make sense of things. Social media, with its algorithms and all that, can become this breeding ground for conspiracy theories and just, completely baseless claims.
Yeah, the article mentions things like false information about Card's arrest record, inaccuracies about his past, even attempts to connect him to things that had absolutely nothing to do with him.
It's a reminder that we need to be really careful about what we believe, especially when emotions are running high. Critical thinking is so important these days. Being aware of our own biases, our emotional reactions, how those things can influence what we choose to believe and share.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the outrage, the fear, and just, want simple answers. But that's often where misinformation thrives.
Right. We can't let those emotions completely cloud our judgment. We need to be willing to question things, to verify information, go to credible sources. Otherwise, we're just contributing to the problem, spreading harmful narratives and potentially causing even more pain to those who are already hurting.
And you mentioned credible sources, and the article points to a really important one: the independent commission that was formed to investigate the shootings. This commission, led by Daniel Wathen, they released their report in August of 2024, and they seem to have uncovered some pretty troubling details.
The commission's report is huge because they're not just looking at Card, they're looking at the system. And they conclude that there were some serious failures, missed opportunities that might have prevented this. They say that both the police and the Army Reserve had multiple chances to intervene.
So they're saying the local sheriff's office, they actually had enough evidence to get a yellow flag ordered to take away Card's guns back in September 2023. They didn't do it.
Didn't do it. And the report is also critical of the Army Reserve, saying they didn't do enough to address his mental health issues, to restrict his access to weapons. They even highlight this text message from one of Card's fellow reservists to an Army supervisor. The text says, and I quote, "I believe he's going to snap and do a mass shooting."
I mean, that's chilling. That's such a clear warning. And yet it seems like nobody listened. It's hard not to feel angry, frustrated, knowing that this might have been preventable.
Yeah, it's understandable, all these missed opportunities, the what ifs. But I think it's important to remember that the Commission's report, it's not about assigning blame. It's about identifying what went wrong, and advocating for change, better mental health support, stricter gun safety measures, holding people accountable.
Yeah, recognizing that we as a society, we can do better.
Exactly. And there's one more piece of this puzzle we should look at. It wasn't in the initial Wikipedia article, but it adds another layer of complexity: the examination of Robert Card's brain after his death.
Oh, right. His family actually donated his brain to be studied at Boston University at their CTE center. They specialize in traumatic brain injuries. And the findings, I mean, they were significant.
Oh, yeah. So here we go, from the social, the systemic factors into, neurology. And the exam revealed some pretty serious damage: missing white matter, scarring, inflammation in his brain.
And they compared it to what you might see in, veterans exposed to blasts, even though Card himself never saw combat.
Right. But remember, he was a grenade instructor in the Army Reserve for 8 years. So that means thousands of blasts. They didn't actually find CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, but they did confirm that he had suffered a traumatic brain injury.
So the big question is, how much did this brain injury contribute to his, to his behavior changes, his paranoia, his delusions? Could it have even played a role in what he did?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Dr. Ann McKee, she led the examination, and she said, based on their research, that it's likely the brain injury was a factor in his symptoms.
It adds another layer of complexity to an already tragic and confusing story.
It really does, and it underscores how important it is to approach these situations with nuance, to avoid oversimplifying things, to resist jumping to those easy conclusions.
Yeah, it seems like the more we learn about this, the more complicated it gets. It's like, there's no easy answer.
Right, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations, these deep dives. We're not trying to just rehash the headlines, We're trying to really understand what happened, the why. And sometimes there isn't a simple answer.
Right. It's about looking at all the different pieces of the puzzle, all the different factors that contributed to this.
Absolutely. The mental health struggles, the brain injury, the access to guns, the influence of ideology, it's all connected. And sadly, it's a story we've seen before in other communities.
Yeah, that seemingly ordinary person who, for whatever reason, gets radicalized online. The cries for help that go unanswered, the warning signs that are missed. It's a tragic pattern.
It really is. And then the consequences, when all of that comes together, they're just devastating.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a lot of questions. Like, how do we stop this from happening again?
And that's a good place to be, you know? These are hard questions. They require us to think critically, to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations, to challenge our own beliefs.
It's not about pointing fingers. It's about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to make our communities safer, more compassionate.
Yeah. Whether it's advocating for better mental health care, supporting responsible gun ownership policies, just being more aware of what's happening with the people around us, we can all make a difference.
Maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this, right? Change starts with awareness,
Yeah.
with having the courage to act on that awareness.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I'd encourage everyone listening, take some time to think about what we've talked about today. What's stuck with you? What questions are still in your mind? And most importantly, what can you do? Even small things can make a difference.
Right, even a little bit of kindness, a little bit of compassion and understanding could have a ripple effect.
Well, thank you for joining us for this, tough but important conversation.
And we'll be back next week with a new deep dive.
Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.